Official Declaration of Cessation of Communion with the Heretical Ecumenists, compiled by Elder Savvas Lavriotis, following the request of many faithful Orthodox Christians who wish to officially submit their excommunication by the local bishop. Society Cessation Declaration. Your Excellency, Mr. With this letter I inform you that, following the teaching of the holy and God-bearing fathers of our Orthodox Church on the subject of communion with heretics, I am severing communion with you and ceasing to attend church in churches in which your name is commemorated during the holy services, due to the heresy that you follow and advocate. The interruption of church communion, namely the interruption of the commemoration of the bishop who preaches heresy with his head bare, and by extension the mandatory application of the 15th canon, according to the patristic and spiritual manner, is the only action imposed by the Orthodox faithful for the confrontation, suppression, and ultimately condemnation of heresy by the healthy body of the Church, clergy, and people. For the sake of truth, I refer you to some of our saints who had implemented the interruption of church communion. Break of communion between the great Athanasius, Patriarch of Alexandria, the great Anthony and other elders, monks and hieromonks of the Egyptian desert with the heretical Arians. Break in communion between the Orthodox faithful of Antioch, who follow the Orthodox Eustathius of Antioch, with the heretical Arians and their own Arian bishop of Antioch. Break in communion of monks and laity with Bishop Gregory of Nazianzus, father of Saint Gregory the theologian, who signed a semi-Arian, homoousion, symbol of faith. Break in communion between Basil the Great and the Archbishop of Caesarea, Dionysius, who signed an unorthodox confession. Break in communion between Saint Gregory the theologian and the Arian Archbishop of Constantinople, Demophilus. Break in communion of the Orthodox Patriarch of Constantinople, Akakios, with the Monophysite Patriarchs Timothy II of Alexandria, called Ailuros, and Peter II of Antioch, called Nathaios. Cessation of communion of the Orthodox faithful of Constantinople with the heretical Patriarch of Constantinople, Nestorius, before his synodal condemnation by the Third Ecumenical Council. Break in communion of the Orthodox faithful of Constantinople with the Monophysite Patriarch of Constantinople, Timothy I. Interruption of communion of Saint Maximus the Confessor and of his 2 monks' disciples with the patriarchal thrones who followed the heresy of monothelitism. Interruption of communion of Saint John of Damascus with the iconoclastic bishops, both before and after the iconoclastic council of the priesthood, 754. Interruption of communion of Saint Theodore the Studite, initially with the adulterous bishops and then with the economist bishops. Break in communion between Patriarch Sergius of Constantinople and Pope Sergius, when the latter, in 1009, had recited the creed with the addition of the Filioque. Intermission of communion of Orthodox believers, bishops, clergy, and laity, as well as the Mount Athos Fathers, with the Latin-minded Patriarch of Constantinople, John Vecos. Interruption of communion between Saint Gregory Palamas, then a hieromonk, and the Latin-minded Patriarch of Constantinople, John XIV, known as Calikas, prior to the synodal condemnation of the latter. Intermission of communion of Saint Mark Eugenikos, Metropolitan of Ephesus, and other Orthodox bishops, clergy, monks, and laity with the Latin-minded Patriarch of Constantinople, Metrophanes, and the other Latin-minded people. See, for example, Basiliao Stephanidis, Ecclesiastical History, 7th ed. Papadimitriou, Athens, 1959. The main reason I proceed to the salutary apotheosis of you and the other heretical ecumenists is that you not only openly preach heresy with words, but you also ratified it in a synodal manner, signing and therefore accepting all the voted texts of the heretical pseudo-synodal Council of Crete. The conclusions drawn from the study of the communicated final texts of the so-called Holy and Great Council, as well as from the responses and analyses of authorized theologians and metropolitans, are that the goal of ecclesiasticalizing the heresies was finally achieved. That is, it was accepted that the papacy, as well as other heretics, are churches and not heresies. The heresy of ecumenism was officially and synodally legalized, as recognized by the Protestant so-called World Council of Churches, or rather, heresies. Post-patristic theology was established. Decisions of ecumenical councils were annulled. Orthodox spirituality is being distorted. It destroyed orthodox synodality. Unorthodox methods were used in its operation. The decisions of the council are binding on all laity and clergy under the pretext of upholding or supposedly defending genuine orthodoxy, however destroying the role of the people who are responsible for preserving the unadulterated Orthodox faith. It does not follow the patristic and spiritual tradition of the Church, and there was no recognition from the beginning of all the previous councils. We had the participation of observers for the first time who were papal, and we even had joint prayers during the liturgies. As is known, the main task of an Orthodox synod is to confront the resurgent heresies within the bosom of the Church. At the synod, exactly the opposite happened, for, as can be seen from the texts voted on, and especially from the text, relations of the Orthodox Church towards the Christian world, the pan-heresy of syncretistic, inter-Christian ecumenism was adopted, institutionalized and legitimized by a pan-Orthodox synodal decision as the official and legitimate line and teaching of the Orthodox Church. They recognized ecclesiasticism, apostolic succession, priesthood, grace, and mysteries in the heretical papists, Protestants, and monophysites, and adopted the malicious, deluded, heretical, and ecumenical theories of baptismal theology, Eucharistic ecclesiology, and divided church, while at the same time they ratified the stay of the Orthodox Church in the endless anti-patristic and ineffective modern theological dialogues, and in the pan-Protestant World Council of Churches, or better, of heresies and errors. This specific dogmatic decision is found in the following demonic phrase: the Orthodox Church accepts the historical name of those not in communion with it of other heterodox Christian churches and confessors. These heretical groups are referred to as other heterodox Christian churches and confessions, taking into account the fact that in this particular dogmatic decision, the word heresy is not mentioned at all, in contrast to the sacred canons, which make extensive use of this term. This means that the Orthodox Church is considered as another Christian church or confession. That is, both the Orthodox Church and the other heterodox Christian churches and confessions have the same faith, but differ only in its theological formulation. That is what the PSE advocates and what the Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew has been stating for years. And for this reason, in order for there to be syncretistic unity of the Orthodox Church with the heretical groups, there remains to be progress in the convergence of their theological formulations as to the subject of their supposedly common faith. They formulate this dogmatic decision as follows: a faster and more objective clarification of the entire ecclesiological subject, and especially of the more general teaching of them on the mysteries, grace, priesthood, and apostolic succession. This dogmatic decision is heretical because, while according to the ontological nature of the Church, unity already exists and therefore it is impossible to disturb it, nevertheless the Orthodox Church objectively aims at smoothing a path that leads to another unity, different from the ontological one, that is the syncretistic one and not the true faith. This normalization of unity between the Orthodox Church and the heretics is sought to be achieved through bilateral and multilateral theological dialogues within the framework of the ecumenical movement of recent times. Specifically, in paragraph 16, the following is noted. One of the main bodies in the history of the ecumenical movement is the World Council of Churches, WCC. In parallel, there are other inter-Christian organizations and regional bodies, such as the Conference of European Churches, CEC, the Middle East Council of Churches, MECC, and the Pan-African Council of Churches. These, according to the World Council of Churches, are now carrying out an important mission for the promotion of the unity of the Christian world. We ask, has the unity of Christ's Church been divided? Or rather, are those who do not follow the diachronicity of Christ's Church, which is expressed in the Apostles, the ecumenical councils, and the Holy Fathers, divided and cut off? This constitutes blasphemy of the Holy Spirit, a terrible departure from the synodally defined faith of the Church and from the creed in which we confess and believe in one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. At the Council of Crete, 10 autocephalous churches, including the Church of Greece, but also the institutional Holy Mountain, since it had sent an official representative, accepted the theologian's baptismal theology, and indirectly the theory of branches, recognizing the papal Maronite Nestorian monophysite churches as their own. The monotheists, who were judged in the series of ecumenical councils from the 3rd to the 7th, but also the whole of the Protestants, who instead represent the so-called churches in the World Council. The synodal decision, therefore, to recognize as churches those judged by the ecumenical council, the synod in Columbari introduces the concept of comparison and ecumenism as the main theological line in the Orthodox Church, which, from now on and in the future, will be followed by those who will remain in communion with Patriarch Bartholomew and his counselors. Moreover, immediately after the synod, the same was officially declared by him, saying, "We have entered the post-patristic period of the Church. The secular Council of Columbari is now officially accepted by the World Council of Churches. Secrets because 1. Accepted the Toronto Declaration." In the controversial text of the Columbarium, Relations, the Toronto Declaration is mentioned by name and praised, a text agreed upon in 1950 by the Orthodox and the other members of the so-called World Council of Churches. the WCC, founded in 1948, where Orthodox Protestants monophysites participate. It is said in the Columbarium text, Pius section 19, that the Orthodox member churches are deeply convinced that the ecclesiological prerequisites of the Toronto Declaration are of paramount importance for Orthodox participation in the Council, that is, in the WCC. In the Toronto Declaration, although some correct ecclesiological clarifications are made, it is nevertheless stated, among other errors, that the member churches recognize that being a member of the Church of Christ is more inclusive than being a member of one's own church. Chap 4, Section 3. Consequently, the Church of Christ is supposedly not limited to orthodoxy, but there is a church, that is, salvation, outside of orthodoxy, in the realm of heresy, according to the Toronto Declaration. 2. He accepted the proposals of Porto Alegre, Busan, Balamond, etc. Columbari, through the same text above, Relations, praises the theological dialogues between orthodox and heretics so far because, for example, it positively evaluates the theological texts published by it, the relevant committee of the WCC, which constitute a valuable step in the ecumenical movement for the rapprochement of Christians. Porto Section 21. This indirect ratification, even if it does not name the more specific positions of these texts, nevertheless ratifies them collectively. Moreover, let us not forget that the ecumenical councils of Pentecost, Second Canon, and Seventh, First Canon, gave ecumenical validity to the sacred canons of the local councils without referring to them in detail. A careful look shows what unacceptable and heretical things have been written, unfortunately, in the most important of the texts of the theological dialogues. The text of Porto Alegre, WCC, Brazil, 2006, says, Pius section 6-7, that every church, whether Orthodox or Protestant, etc., of the WCC, is the Catholic Church, but not the whole. Each church fulfills its Catholicity when it is in communion with the other churches. One without the other, we are bankrupt. And that, section 5, there may be legitimately different formulations of the faith of the church. That is, the differentiation of dogmas does not harm. The Busan text, WCC, South Korea, 2013, says, among many other falsehoods, that we regret the divisions between and within our churches, which undermine our witness to the gospel of Jesus Christ. Pius, section 14. In other words, we regret that the Holy Fathers saved us from heresies, cutting them off from the church. The Balamand Agreement, Lebanon, 1993, between Orthodox and heretical papists says, or section 13-14, that it is recognized by both sides that what Christ entrusted to his church cannot be considered the property of only one of our churches. Within this framework, it is obvious that any kind of Anabaptism is excluded. Also, that the Orthodox and Catholic churches recognize each other as sister churches, jointly responsible for maintaining the Church of God in fidelity to the divine plan, and especially in what concerns unity. Moreover, it is declared, Parcel Section 30, that the responsibilities for the separation are shared between Orthodox and Papists. Nevertheless, the Synod of Columbarium, as a decent heretical synod, misleadingly declared that the dialogues conducted by the Orthodox Church have never meant, do not mean, and will never mean any compromise on matters of faith. These dialogues are a testimony to orthodoxy. Encyclical 7, Section 20. As for the other issues of the pseudo-council, we also mention some important issues that demonstrate how heretical and anti-orthodox it is. A. Marriage. As for the issue of mixed marriages, while in I-5 the canonical accuracy is defined based on the canon of Pentecost, in the second U5, and for the sake of economy, the possibility is provided to each local church to deal with the issue voluntarily. First of all, it must be made known what the canon of Pentecost includes. It says that the marriage of an Orthodox and a heretic is prohibited under penalty of excommunication, and if by chance some finally proceed with such a marriage, it is to be considered invalid, and subsequently the unlawful union is to be dissolved. In his interpretation of the canon, St. Nicodemus Pedalian p. 283 emphasizes that the wolf should never be united with the sheep, and the lot of sinners and heretics with the portion of Christ and the Orthodox. On the same page, in the relevant footnote of the saint, it is stated that the bishops of the islands, where there are also Latins, are obliged in no way to forgive a Latin man marrying an Orthodox woman, or a Latin woman marrying an Orthodox man. For what communion can there be between the Orthodox and the heretical? These are mentioned in relation to the canon, but in the synodal text, all of this is essentially annulled without any justification on the pretext of an unclear economy, but without canonical foundation and interpretation, as is the case in all the texts of the so-called Synod. The worst thing is that the council itself allows chaos to be created, since each local church will choose, without any pan-orthodox unanimity, what to do. The purpose of this specific provision is clear and is described in numerous ecumenical declarations accepting the fact of mixed marriages, with the aim of overcoming the historical divisions and the unsouled unity of the original undivided church, and constitutes a common ecumenical response. Indicatively, we mention that in the text of the Catechism of the Papal Church, at the end of the chapter on marriage in Article 1636, it is stated that through ecumenical dialogue, Christian communities in many regions have been able to put into effect a common pastoral practice for mixed marriages. 5 emphasis in the original. At the end of the article, there is a reference to 821, which speaks of the ways in which the papists can work for the unity of the divided church. It is clear that the issue of mixed marriages is connected with the new ecumenical ways of seeking the supposed lost unity. In 818, the theological foundation on which the acceptance of mixed marriages as a sacrament of the church is based is also mentioned. It is the baptism that they have received, each in their own church. In other words, baptismal theology is the basis which was adopted as its official teaching by the Second Vatican Council, which in turn constitutes the foundation of the Eucharistic theology, which also constitutes the new ecclesiology of the papacy. Indeed, 818 uses as a reference the decree on ecumenism of the Second Vatican Council, Unitatis Redintegratio 3a. The examples used and the remarks made about mixed marriages in the text under consideration also clarify for us the reason for which the final text of Crete was chosen: to leave the pastoral approach to the local churches, instead, as it should have been, of having a comprehensive position obligatory for all, and in the spirit of the sacred canons. The churches in which the spirit of ecumenism has not yet consumed everything should have been forced to accept the decisions of other, more progressive local churches, which, having in order to level everything, and they impose their practice as legal and discreet, and most importantly as orthodox. The examples all come from where else? The USA and the Greek Archdiocese there, as well as the Metropolitan Synod of the Russians, Moscow Patriarchate. On the one hand, all mixed marriages are canonically already sanctified. On the other hand, through some ecclesiastical service, mixed marriages of Orthodox and non-Orthodox, which have taken place in non-Orthodox churches, are recognized. In other words, it is about the complete consolidation of ecumenism at the local ecclesiastical level, according to the instructions. So we have a declaration of bad faith with this decision because A. By abolishing, as we said above, the Council abrogates the 72nd canon of the Pentecostal Ecumenical Council, and not only that, but also the 14th of the 4th Ecumenical Council, the 1st and 2nd of the Laodicean Council, and the 10th and 11th canons of Carthage. It essentially means the abrogation of entire ecumenical councils, according to Scripture. For whoever keeps the whole law, and yet stumbles in one point, has become guilty of all. James 2:10. How then do we annul those things which the Holy Spirit has taught? This constitutes blasphemy against the Fathers, the Holy Spirit, and of course proof that we have entered, according to Patriarch Bartholomew, the post-patristic era of the Church. B. With this decision, ecumenism is introduced into the family without any doubt, and the soteriological mission of marriage is deconstructed, because how can there be a life together and, by extension, a common path towards Christ, which is the purpose of married life, when the members of the marriage do not believe in the same God? C. The fruit of the marriage, the children. Which path will they follow? The path of the strict Orthodox faith, or of the ecumenical family model, according to the ideals that they experientially and empirically live and move by? D. Is there an acceptance of baptismal theology in practice? Because how can we introduce an unbaptized person into the mysteries of our church? And E. It introduces chaos into the church, since, as we said above, each local church will choose autonomously, under the pretext of the economy of the people, according to the discretion always available to each bishop, whether to perform mixed marriages. B. Fasting. What has already been mentioned regarding the text of marriage also applies to this case of fasting. Up to Article 8, the institution of fasting is praised, and its good fruits are presented, even making use of patristic sources such as Basil the Great, Gregory the Theologian, Gregory Palamas, etc. And while what was necessary for the issue of fasting had already been said in the first 7 articles, albeit in a terse manner a reasonable reader would expect, as a conclusion from the Council, the confirmation of the validity of fasting, according to tradition. However, quite the opposite. In Article 8, what has been written up to that point is completely overturned. And here we should make a parenthesis. This is the tactic of the ecumenists. That is, together with the truth, they immediately tell the lie that undermines the orthodox dogma. Specifically from the simple observation of the fact of the non-observance of fasts by contemporary lukewarm Christians, we are led through pastoral concern to the acceptance of the contempt for the regulated fasts. The discussion is about them, not simply about fasting in general as happened, and to the consolidation of this type of economy. While initially in Article 8 there is talk of a relaxation of the fast, although it is literally about its cancellation by the believers, then and after just a few lines he forgets it and cites other reasons: illness, military service, working conditions, climate, as well as difficulty in digesting fasting foods. That is, there is not even the elementary internal unity in the text, instead of the pastoral church pushing for a solution to those of the above that can be arranged, for example, military nutrition, cooperation with trade bodies, etc. The easy path of abolishing fasting, and in essence the ascetic conduct of the church, is preferred. The reason is, of course, none other than the convergence with the secularized Christians of the West, the brothers of our so-called ecumenists, who have abolished all the ancient provisions on fasting. It is therefore none other than the application of the ecumenism of this basis, the reason for the existence of this specific text. As for the ecclesiastical formality and canonicality of the council, we have the following: the so-called ACMS, through the mouths of bishops and other participants, after the end of its work, it did not dare before, was called the Second Vatican Council of Orthodoxy, as the equivalent, that is, of the last ecumenical council, the 21st of the papacy, which created enormous upheavals within it, bringing about changes of such importance that it was characterized by its own protagonists as cutting across the history of the church in the era before and after the council. What is interesting and compels us to refer to the council of the papacy are the methodological similarities of the ACMS to it. Thus, for the convening of a pan-Orthodox council, it is widely known that the working method of the Second Vatican Council served in some way as a model for these procedures. 10 indeed, the Inter-Orthodox Preparatory Commission, the pre-synodal pan-Orthodox conferences, the permanent secretariat for the preparation of the synod, and finally the method of preparing and editing the texts of the ACM, all reflect the modus operandi of Vatican II. 11. However, let us see what Saint Nicodemus the Athonite says regarding the criteria for recognizing a council as ecumenical. A. The council must be convened not by a patriarch, but by royal decree, something which is currently impossible, and therefore ineffective without further theological complications. B. There must be a question about faith, and then a decision and a dogmatic term must be presented. C. They must that all the established dogmas and canons be orthodox reverently and in accordance with the Holy Scriptures or the preceding ecumenical councils, and the holy Nicodemus adds the much stories, as he says, axiom of St. Maximus that the councils that are held reverential faith is valid, and again the correctness of the dogmas judges the councils. D. Finally, they must agree and accept the present ecumenical councils, appointed and regulated by all the Orthodox patriarchs and bishops of the Catholic Church, either by their own personal presence or by their own representatives, or even in their absence by their own letters 12. The above should serve as a guide in the final evaluation of both the ecumenical pan-Orthodox character of the ACM, as well as the extent to which it truly constitutes a continuation of the ecumenical councils that preceded it, according to faith. First, the question arises as to whether and to what extent the requirement of the regulation for the pan-Orthodox validity of the council is met. The only possible answer is no, because, as is known, 4 local churches were absent. From this alone is the pan-Orthodox, the ecumenical in its character derived. In texts circulated before the session, there was frequent reference to the unprecedented and extremely problematic nature of the session's rules of procedure. First of all, Article 8, Paragraph 2, essentially defines the prohibition of the free appointment of bishops or even of the primates of the local churches on new, non-unanimously agreed issues in the pre-conciliar pan-Orthodox conferences. This, in the diachronic functioning of the synodal institution, constitutes a very serious distortion of it and essentially works towards its silencing and annulment. In all the councils there was complete freedom for any bishop to raise an issue for discussion and resolution. Then in 9.3, which essentially functions as a continuation of 8.2, any intervention by a bishop is expressly prohibited under penalty of removal of speech on an off-topic issue. On the contrary, in all the councils of the Church, there was complete freedom of speech for everyone, even for non-bishops, as we see, for example, in the discussion between monks and Saint Tarasios, Act A of the 7th Ecumenical Council. The above prohibitions are extended to 10.3 regarding irrelevant dialogical controversies of the bishops, as if the bishops were unaware of their mission and the height of their office, and thus diverted supposedly into disputes foreign but also opposed to the mission of the council as mentioned in the text. In 1.1.2, 2, the necessary principle of unanimity of amendments to the initial preconciliarly agreed upon texts for the formation of the final texts is established, as well as the rejection of amendments not unanimously accepted. And we ask, in which Orthodox synod on a dogmatic issue was there a case of rejection of a dogmatic formulation, amendment according to the phraseology of the synod, and everything continued normally? We remind ourselves of what the holy Nicodemus the Athonite told us constitutes the third criterion of a true ecumenical council, the orthodoxy of its doctrines. Is it possible for there to be disagreement on a doctrinal issue and for the disputants to continue as if nothing had happened? It thus becomes clear that the so-called ACM operated as if it were a parliament, where members of political parties vote for or against an amendment to a state law, and not a spiritual assembly of pastors who are united in faith and truth. 12.1 refers to the voting on the final texts and shapes a reality that is superficially synodical, but in fact completely anti-synodal and completely unwitnessing the Catholic holy synodal conscience of the Church. Specifically, the practice followed throughout time in all councils, local or ecumenical, was the full and equal participation of the bishops everywhere, understood as shepherds. The bishops, precisely because of the equality of their hierarchies, all voted and were not, supposedly, represented by their first and his vote. This new procedure annulled the timeless ecclesiological principle of the relationship of bishop to bishop and separated the former, the presidents, that is the local autocephalous churches, from the latter bishops, resulting in the formation of two types of bishops, one for the former and the other for all the others, with the essential distinction that the former votes now representing the Church, while the latter the rest did not. Synodality in this way led to something new which, after Crete, will function as a given historical precedent that will now determine the function of all subsequent great councils, which has already been announced in what will happen. In other words, those who destroyed the synodality of the Church themselves in order to be able to outvote and pass their positions synodally, destroyed it in the most brutal way. Interwoven with 12.1 are also 12.2 and 12.3, in which the foundation of the episcopal office, understood in orthodoxy, is expanded, resulting in the establishment of a new one, the episcopate oliko. Specifically, in order for there to be an affirmative or negative vote on the final texts, an internal vote of the entire delegation of each local church is preceded by the first of each local church, in which there may not be unanimity even on dogmatic issues. In simple words, one or more bishops may disagree, but as a minority they accept the decision, which is ultimately the decision of the majority. The evaluation of the Daphnes now constitutes, according to 1.2.3, an internal matter of each local church. The result of all this is that a minority, according to the internal voting of the episcopal delegations, a bishop with a declared disagreement on a doctrinal issue, for example, returns to his diocese and is forced to teach the opposite of what he taught before leaving for the council. This was also the ultimate goal of the neo-pagan way of unanimity on the final texts, as far as the life of each, under a bishop local church, is concerned. Further approval of the decisions of the ACM is not foreseen, that is, its decisions are final and, as explicitly stated in 1.3.2, they now have pan-orthodox validity and are simply communicated to the autocephalous local churches for the information of the flock of the holy metropolises. Concluding these few words about the regulation of the ACM, we limit ourselves to stating what has already become clear. The Assembly of Crete absolutely does not meet any criteria for an orthodox council. Its terms of operation and the conduct of its work, which led to its relevant decisions, literally constitute an anti-council, and without a doubt what in ecclesiastical literature is characterized as a pseudo-council, the imposition of the presence of unholy, heterodox, and pseudo-bishops, both at the opening and at the closing of the work of the synod, something that is also provided for by its rules of procedure. Article 14 clarifies for us the general tone, character, and purpose of this specific gathering. In Article 22 of the text, Relations of the Orthodox Church towards the Christian World, it is written, "The Orthodox Church considers condemnable any division of the unity of the Church by individuals or groups under the pretext of upholding or supposedly defending genuine orthodoxy." The above invalid article is heretical because it violates the ecclesiological principle of the ecclesiastical authority of the body of the Church. Other clergy, monks, and laity, together with the hierarchs, synodical and non-synodal, to accept or reject decisions on matters of faith from the latter, making the decisions binding even if they are not in accordance with previous orthodox councils. The attempt to impose persecutions, demotions, and excommunications on those who oppose the Holy and Great Council on behalf of the primates of the Orthodox churches is clear here. In this certain case of persecution of those who interrupt the memorial service by the official governing church, It must be made known and clear that the Orthodox Church will be saved and will exist only in those who interrupt the memorial service of the ecumenical hierarchs, and not in the official governing church, which, through the acceptance of ecumenism in the Holy and Great Council, will become ecumenical and modern. So, for this so-called council to be orthodox, it would have to, first, to condemn the pan-heresy of ecumenism or religious syncretism. Second, to condemn the World Council of Churches as a World Council of Heresies, by declaring that the one holy, Catholic, and Apostolic Church is the Orthodox, and that only within its bosom is the purification, enlightenment, and theization of man achieved, and by extension, our salvation. Third, the convocation should be held with a valid decision, and not as it was, in violation of the established principle of unanimity in the cooperation of the autocephalous Orthodox churches. Fourth, that all participating hierarchs should have a decisive vote, according to Orthodox ecclesiology and Orthodox canon law, and not only the 10 autocephalous churches, according to the model of the Organization for Inter-Christian Comparison, entitled PSE. Fifth, not to claim supreme authority in matters of faith, because supreme authority in relation to false theology belongs only to the body of the Church, that is, to the councils of the synodal bishops, since decisions on matters of faith from the latter are approved by the other bishops and are accepted by the other clergy, monks, and laity in accordance with Orthodox theology and canon law. 6. He should have dealt with the old calendar issue, and indeed so that we could return to the ecclesiastical situation before 1924. Seventh, to condemn Freemasonry, millennialism, neo-paganism, Scientology, as well as other new sects and para-religious groups that proselytize and distance Christians from the Orthodox faith and life. 8. To condemn the so-called post-patristic theology. Unfortunately, many hierarchs and theologians, far from the patristic, ascetic, and Orthodox mindset, believe that we have no need for the Fathers and that their theology is outdated for our era. If possible, the Holy Fathers are the bright guides for every era. 9th, to condemn neo-atheism because we see how in our country too a union of atheists has been created which, unfortunately, is doing great damage to our Orthodox faith, mainly affecting the younger generation. 10th, to condemn the electronic filing system and all kinds of citizen cards which lead us to the global dictatorship of the Antichrist. The Church of the Saved consists only of the sum of the saints who are united in the excellence of faith and state excellence, 15 according to St. Isidore of Pelusiotis. The Church of Christ is found only where the truth exists. Those who are not in the truth do not belong to the Church of Christ, according to St. Gregory Palamas 16. Therefore, I hierocanonically break communion, not only with you, but also with those who commune with all those who accepted the pseudo-synodal council in accordance with the 15th canon. The 15th Holy Canon of the Second Council under St. Photius, the great patriarch of Constantinople, 861 AD, precisely states that the things mentioned about presbyters and bishops and metropolitans are more appropriate for the patriarch. If any elder bishop or metropolitan dares to send a letter to the patriarch of the church, and does not mention his name as prescribed and ordained, if he is a heretic, but rather openly commits a schism of synodal judgment and complete self-condemnation, the one whom the Holy Synod has appointed for all heresy is completely alien to him, and only if he is to be punished for what he has done. And these things are sealed and determined about the pretext of some of the crimes of the private dissident presidents, and those who are causing schism and dividing the unity of the Church, for by taking some from among the holy synods or fathers condemned, the communion of the president of these expanding, that is to say, those who preach publicly and teach with their heads uncovered in the Church, are not only subject to the canonical judgment of those who are in communion with the called bishop, but are also entitled to the honor due to the Orthodox. They have not only recognized bishops, but also false bishops and false teachers, and they have divided the unity of the Church by schism, but they have studied to destroy the Church by schisms and divisions. The son of Nicodemus the Athonite, interpreting the above holy canon, states, that which the above canons, 13th and 14th, have appointed concerning bishops and metropolitans, appoints these and much more. The present canon concerning patriarchs, saying that in the case of a presbyter or bishop or metropolitan, he may be separated from the communion of the patriarch himself, and does not mention his name according to custom. The metropolitan that is alone, the presbyter the name of his bishop mentions, the bishop of his metropolitan before they reveal what is against the patriarch himself, in the synod, and by the synod he is condemned. These, I say, should all be completely deposed, the bishops and metropolitans of all hierarchical energy, the presbyters of all priesthood, Except for these things, if for certain crimes, such as fornication, adultery, and others, the presbyters are separated from their bishops, the bishops from their metropolitans, and the metropolitans from their patriarchs. With a footnote to this point, the Sun reports, the Apostolic Church also judges the one who is separated as irresponsible, if he knows that he is also unjust. If the said presidents are heretics and openly preach their heresy, and because of this their subjects are separated, and before a synodal judgment is made about this heresy, those who are separated, not only are they not condemned for the separation, but they are also worthy of the honor that is due as orthodox, because they did not cause a schism in the church by this separation, but rather they liberated the church from the schism and the removal of these false bishops. 17. The above holy canon is also in accordance with other holy canons of local and ecumenical councils, such as the Apostolic Canon, the Canon of the Ganges, Local Council 340, the Canon of the Antioch Local Council 341, the Canon of the Laodicean Local Council, the Canons 1st, the 2nd, and 7th of the Carthage Local Council 419, the Canons 1st and the 2nd of the 4th Ecumenical Council, 451, the Canons Warfan and the 2nd of the 6th Ecumenical Council, 691, and the Canon of the 12th, 13th, 14th of the 2nd Council, 861. Following all of this, I am attaching 2 letters to you, the confessional letter of cessation of communion of the Athonite Fathers to the community of the Holy Mountain, the also confessional letter of cessation of communion of Elder Savvas Lavriotis to the Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew, as well as a text with historical sources of the hierocanonical canonization of saints, with the rules and sayings from the Holy Scripture that enshrine my own canonization. Your Excellency, the Orthodox faith, as handed down to us by the Holy Fathers, is the only path to salvation. Observing Christ's commandment of love presupposes the observance of his unchanging truth. The Eastern Orthodox Church, and no other, is the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church of Christ. All those outside of it are heretics. The struggle against the storm of ecumenism, this terrible and terrible pan-heresy that has no precedent in the 2,000 years of ecclesiastical history, is always within the Orthodox Church, and in accordance with the holy canons, the 7+2 ecumenical councils, the commandments and the models of the saints and God-bearing fathers. Those of us Orthodox Christians who proceed with the act of hierocanonical apotheosis, not only do we not cause schism, but on the contrary we preserve the Orthodox faith unadulterated and liberate the Church of Christ from the communion of heresies and schisms of pseudo-bishops such as you and your like-minded ones. On the contrary, all of you have placed yourselves outside the Orthodox Church, of which only those of us who are canonically ordained now comprise. I have been compelled to make this present declaration confession, and I am, in this regard, accountable before God. As a sinner then, but always a member of his body, the time has come for me to exercise my sacred right, to defend orthodoxy and to fulfill my most sacred duty, to confess Christ and his truth. Precisely because I am a sinner, I confess to him with this, having the firm conviction that, if nothing else, at least I will be spared the hell of perdition, and my being numbered with all those whom the holy confessors and the councils, the holy canons of our Orthodox faith, have condemned as sharing in communion with the heretics and heretics. In addition to the above, I expressly and categorically, and with full knowledge declare, in defense of my Orthodox conscience and in confession of my Orthodox faith, the following, I deny and reject, are all the decisions of the robber pseudo-congress in Kolimbari, Crete, in 2016 as heretical and devoid of the Holy Spirit. B. The proclamation of the pseudo-autocephaly of the schismatic and unconsecrated Ukrainian Church as an uncanonically arbitrary encroachment on the ecclesiastical jurisdiction of the Moscow Patriarchate. C. All the above actions of you and your like-minded bishops and elders from March 2020 to the present day, under the pretext of the COVID-19 pandemic as anti-orthodox, anti-ecclesiastical, and a result of your and those decisions of the above pseudo-council and pan-heresy of ecumenism. Applying the 31st Apostolic Canon and the 15th Holy Canon of the 1st, 2nd Holy Synod, I cease to recognize you as a shepherd in the type of Christ and a sharer of the ways of the Holy Apostles, as well as all those who are in communion with you with the Archbishop Patriarch of Constantinople, His Holiness Bartholomew's successor and continuator of the followers of the Patriarch of Constantinople, His Holiness Demetrius Athenagoras, and the followers of the Patriarch of Constantinople, His Holiness. The ecumenical collaborators of this and that, I break off all ecclesiastical communion with you, with them, and I renounce the ecumenical apostasy of you, them for a time, or until you all of them express a sincere heart of repentance, or until you them are condemned by a synod. I remain within the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church, which is only the Orthodox Eastern Church, recognizing that it is composed only of those monks, clergy, and laity who have declared in writing and under their own name to you and your like-minded bishops their canonical apostolate and the confession of their Orthodox faith. Therefore I reject and do not commune with those anti-ecumenists, monks, clergy, and laity, who in any other way than the above, which is clear and binding name, ecumenism as a heresy, but either continue to participate in the divine liturgy, in the sacred mysteries with the celebrants, or commemorated heretics, the ecumenist bishops or patriarchs, thus self-denying in the confession of their orthodox faith. Whether they continue to concelebrate or to commemorate in the divine liturgy, such heretical ecumenist bishops or patriarchs, leaving with their bilingualism and their ambiguous ecclesiological practice, the orthodox flock is shaken and disoriented, and without sight, far from the salvation of Christ, the Orthodox Church and faith, exposed and defenseless to heretical attacks. I abstain from any kind of sect or schismatic movement, and group either the GOC and their bishops, or the bishop Mr. Epiphanius, and the schismatic, unordained clergy of the aforementioned pseudo-Ukrainian Church, who are protected by Mr. Bartholomew, as well as anyone else who communicates with them. We will turn to our friend orthodoxy. We are lying in our ancestral respect. In you we were born, in you we live, in you we sleep, if time calls and 1,000 years pass before we die. Iosif Vraienios, the draft text of the Holy and Great Synod of the Orthodox Church, approved by the 5th Pre-Conciliar Pan-Orthodox Conference, Chambézy, Geneva, October 10th, 2015, entitled Decision. Relations of the Orthodox Church with the Christian World, was published in accordance with the decisions of the Synod of Primates of the Orthodox Churches, which was held in Chambézy, Geneva, from January 21st to 28, 2016, on the 28th of January 2016 at the following email address, romfea.gr. In the Cretan texts, the term heretical has been completely eliminated and replaced by that of heterodox. Let us note that the problem with marriages is not at all new. It literally begins with the beginnings of the Church. Catechism of the Catholic Church, Libreria Editrice Vaticana, 2011, 2. It should be noted, however, that the term economy is not used, and this is because a. its boundaries and precise nature should be well defined, and b. it should have been institutionalized through a relevant synodal norm. Mainly it was its decision to adopt ecumenism through the synodal decree Unitatis Redintegraio as a method of uniting Christians, as well as the major changes it brought to liturgical life. Liturgical Reform. Brunn, OPP 231, Analytical Brunn.op, pp. 232-234, St. Nicodemus of Mount Athos, Pedalion, Athens, 1957, p. 118. On this subject, St. Nicodemus notes that, when there is disagreement among some patriarchs, he makes the ecumenical into locale p. 119. The greatest example is this, regarding the acceptance or not of the 6th text, with the dogmatic aim of recognizing ecclesiasticism in heterodox people. St. Isidore of Pelusium, PG 78 685a. St. Gregory Palamas Everything II, p. 627. Holy Nicodemus of Mount Athon, Pedalion Edi v. Rigopoulos, Thessaloniki 2003, p. 358.